Welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am delighted to be joined by Wendy Holden, author of The Teacher of Auschwitz. Wendy, hello.
Hello, Colin. Nice to see you. Nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, let's just dive right into Freddie Hirsch. I am embarrassed to admit that I don't have any recollection of learning about him or his life, which is the whole point of sharing his story through this novel. Tell me about who he was and why he's so important to remember.
He's so important to remember because he is a beacon of hope in the darkness through history, and because for almost 80 years he was largely forgotten and in fact denigrated for many reasons, which I'll explain later. But he was an ordinary young boy, grew up in Aachen in Germany, the son of a butcher and his wife. His father died when he was 10, which was unexpected and shocking to him. And his mother remarried fairly quickly. So he didn't really get on with his stepfather, and he found solace in nature and in the youth movement in the Jewish Scouts. He was young and German and Jewish. And in the Scouts, he not only loved just being outdoors and doing all the things that Scouts do, but he discovered that he had a natural aptitude for mentorship of the younger children. And that really then became and defined his entire life. He was very beautiful to look at, even as a boy. He had a sort of militaristic bearing about him. He was very disciplined. He groomed himself beautifully. He paid attention to his hair and his clothing, and his made sure his fingernails were clean, and he made sure the children's fingernails were clean. They couldn't touch anything until they showed him their fingernails, and they looked up to him enormously. And he continued to mentor them and teach them, as well as honing his athletics passion for athletics. He did hope to become an Olympian, but of course, when the Nazis rose and they came along and everything changed, Jewish scouts were banned, and no Jews would ever be allowed on the German Olympics team. So everything changed for Freddie very dramatically then, as it did for millions of people. He stayed in Germany for a while, but by then he was becoming aware of his own sexuality as well. And that was something that I think to begin with, he was in denial. He hadn't ever met anybody who was gay, and he didn't really understand what he was feeling. And he was embarrassed by it, I think. But eventually, he decided that he couldn't stay in Germany because he was now at risk, double jeopardy, really, for being Jewish and gay. And so he fled to Czechoslovakia, thinking that was far enough. And it wasn't, because the Nazis came there too. But regardless of that, immediately he threw himself into youth leadership again. And the Jewish elders seemed to recognize his abilities immediately. They just seemed to appreciate that he had a way with children. He was incredibly charismatic, very handsome. He had a beaming smile, and he had a way of understanding children, which was really beyond his years. So they had him establish a games center, a sort of park area north of Prague. By this time, the Nuremberg laws were very much in place. And so the children couldn't do 1,000 things that they used to do. They had their bicycles taken. They couldn't go to parks. They couldn't go to swimming pools. They couldn't even cross certain areas. They couldn't travel on trams. So they were able to go to this place, which was way out of town and a long trek for them. But when they got there, every Saturday, Freddie was in charge of thousands of children over the period of time that he did it. And he taught them athletics, he taught them discipline. The ones that weren't so good at athletics, he had them supervise the younger children. He was just marvelous with them. And if anybody came along to challenge why he was there, instead of keeping his head down and not drawing attention to himself, he would stand up to them. And over the course of the time before the camps, he came to appreciate something that was really a revelation to him, but he also realized it could help both him and the children. He realized that the Germans respected him, and they respected him because he looked almost Aryan to them. He was very handsome, very athletic, and he spoke German. He spoke High German, so they appreciated the way he spoke, the way he held himself, the way he stood straight with his shoulders back. And when he was addressing officers, he would salute them, he would click his heels together, he would look them directly in the eye, and he would demand whatever he needed for the children. And incredibly, instead of pulling out pistols and shooting him, they acceded to his demands. So he quickly learned how to manipulate the Germans, really, without them even realizing it. When they decided to set up a Jewish ghetto in Terezin, Theresienstadt, they called it, north of Prague, the Nazis said to the Jewish elders, go ahead and get it ready because thousands of Jews will be coming there. They claimed it was for their own safety, but of course it was simply because they wanted to herd them all into one place at a time. So Freddie was sent as one of the youth leaders and immediately set about doing whatever he could to try and make this rather neglected, derelict garrison town that had barracks that hadn't been lived in for years with holes in the roofs and no services. So he and a group of young men helped try and establish it before thousands started to arrive. And once they did start to arrive, he realized that the children were really in a very dark place there because they were crammed into the barracks with the mothers. The fathers were separated in one whole area. The old people were often put in the attics and very often left to die there. And the mothers had the responsibility for the children in incredibly crowded barracks with just a few meters of space each and sharing a stove. And Freddie pleaded with the elders to allow him to find space to create Kinderheims, children's homes, for the children to go there and be there all day. They could get out from under their mother's feet. They could be taught because there were so many wonderful teachers and professors and artists and scientists and so on in Terezin. It was very high-end Czechs went there and often were tricked into going there and paying huge amounts of money, thinking it was going to be almost like a holiday camp, which of course it wasn't. So he had artists teach them how to paint. He had musicians teach them how to sing. It wasn't just him. There was a whole team, but he was definitely the driving force of it all. And they adored him. They absolutely adored him. And every single time he needed something extra, he wanted the children, for example, to go outside and get some fresh air, which they weren't allowed to do for a very long time. He would go and see these officers, risked his life every time, and demand that they be allowed to do so. And again, he would think of ways in which he could persuade them that this made sense. He would tell them that they were very worried about disease. There was an awful lot of death and disease in the ghetto as more and more people came. And he would tell them that getting them outside and getting them moving, doing athletics and getting fresh air would protect them. And they would not be so liable to disease. He also told the Germans that he would teach them German so that they understood German orders, Nazi orders. And he told them that he would teach them a little military discipline, marching and keeping in line and doing things that the Germans felt were so important throughout the war. So he won privilege after privilege after privilege for these children who really adored him. And I have to say that the reason I first ever heard about Freddie Hirsch, who I'd not heard about before, despite writing several books about the Holocaust, was because I wrote a previous book called 100 Miracles about a survivor called Zuzana Ruzhishkova, who was a young musical prodigy, a teenage musical prodigy, when she arrived in the ghetto in Terezin. And it was so horrific to her what she saw when she got there. It was so alien to her very pampered life as a single child and a very spoilt little girl that she fainted. And when she came to, Freddie Hirsch was standing over her with a bottle of smelling salts, and she sort of fell in love with him, really. And when I was working with Susanna at her home in Prague, and she had survived 3 camps, including Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, with her mother, but almost every other member of her family had perished. She, when she spoke about Freddie Hirsch, it was a whole different atmosphere in the room. It was as if a light had gone on inside her. She just lit up with happiness. And I was just so shaken by that because she was talking about meeting Freddie Hirsch first in Terezin and then following him to Auschwitz. And I realized that this incredible young man, and he was only in his early 20s then, had given her some of the happiest days of her entire life, and they happened to be in these dark, dark places. And from then on, I really had to find out more about him.
You've talked a lot about his just kind of natural aptitude for teaching, for mentorship. Can you talk a little bit more about the challenges he faced in this very inhumane situation, and yet clinging to this aspect of humanity where we shelter each other, we guide each other, and his ability to overcome the circumstances to continue to be the person he was. And I wonder also if you could go a little bit further and talk about some people in your own life that have done that for you to get you to the place where you are now as such a successful speaker and author.
Well, my father was my influence, as very often happens with daughters. He was a wonderful man. He was born in India actually, and he fought the Japanese in Burma. And he was a very avid reader. He was a wonderful person to be around because he was a very great optimist. He loved to laugh, and he was incredibly kind. He was what he called Christian with a small c, which meant that to him that he didn't have to go to church, but he would kneel and pray every night, and every single day he would try to do something kind and be kind. That was his overall message: was be kind, show compassion, show tolerance. I speak a lot in schools to children about respecting difference. And showing compassion based on the books and things I've written, and that's my father speaking through me, absolutely, without a doubt. And Freddie, I mean, he didn't have a father that, really had that effect on him. I don't know enough about his relationship with his dad, but I know that he was very busy as a butcher, and, he probably went to work every day, and Freddie went to school, and then he died when Freddie was 10. But he did have an uncle that he looked up to very much. He was named after him, Alfred, and he really respected his uncle. His uncle actually was the one that originally a tailor, and then he ended up owning lots of businesses relating to tailoring and cloth and so on. And he was the one who dressed terribly well and looked terribly well and wanted Freddie to do the same. So I suppose he was probably the influence. But where that sense of incredible compassion and um, understanding of younger children came from, I really don't know. He was the youngest of two children. His elder brother, Paul, was training to be a rabbi from quite an early age and was quite involved and dedicated to his studies. So Freddie must have just had this kind of natural aptitude to step up and do something. And he was able to teach the children, even the ones who were terrified, as you can imagine, terrified of what might happen to them. Many of them, especially by the time he got to Prague, were already refugees. They'd fled from Germany with their families, and they had either seen members of their families murdered, or they'd had to leave some people behind. And they were suddenly homeless. They were suddenly living in hostels and wherever anybody could find space for them. And here was this handsome young man with a huge smile telling them that it was going to be all right. He taught them meditation. He taught them to close their eyes, lie quietly, or sit quietly and pretend that they weren't afraid. In the camps, he taught them meditation and self hypnosis to pretend that they weren't hungry, that their bellies were full. He was so way ahead of his time. And I don't really know where that came from, but he realized very early on, I think, that what was happening in the world around him was completely out of his control. And the one thing that he could control was caring for the children, focusing on their needs instead of his own. He was the epitome of selflessness. And by focusing on their needs instead of his own, he was able to get through every day. And it was sometimes like, almost getting through every hour in those places, as you can imagine.
So it's clear you've done a wealth of research for this, but it is a novel, and you do have to make it into a story. Can you talk a little bit about the craft involved here? I know you did some alternating chapters, so it's not written chronologically, at least not at first. Talk about some of those craft decisions and how you were able to turn this biographical history into a fictional narrative.
Yes, I'm happy to. I started actually intending to write it as a non-fiction biography, which is really my métier. I've written lots of different books and biographies. I have written novels as well. But I find it harder, and my natural aptitude as a former journalist, as a journalist and a war correspondent for a very long time, 18 years as a journalist and 5 years covering wars. And I have a natural aptitude, I think, for interviewing people about their lives or researching people's lives and writing it down in a readable form. But when I started to dig deeper with Freddie, I discovered that the material, the archive material, was effectively running out. It was dwindling. There was so little about him, and particularly about his personal life, as you can imagine. I mean, for example, when he went to Auschwitz, he created a children's block, which I'll talk about in a minute. But there's not one piece of information in the archives about that. So all the testimonies come from the survivors of that block and the survivors who knew him and knew the children and talked about him. And so I really didn't have the kind of detail that I would need for a proper historical biography, but I was so deep in by then, and I loved him so much that I really felt that I couldn't possibly give up on him. So I decided to switch it to fiction. But I'm very painfully aware that fictionalized Holocaust memoirs and Holocaust stories can be open to criticism, can be open to persecution by Holocaust deniers. So I was extremely thorough and spent a very long time doing the research. And because of my background and because I'm a fellow of the Royal Historical Society in Britain, and that's very important to me, and truth is very important to me, the fictionalized parts are each of them based on some snippet of information in the archive, even if it was just a name or a brief mention of somebody. Those were the bits that I took and embellished slightly. And to be completely transparent, at the back of the book, I list all the fictional characters and then I list all the true life characters, so that there's no confusion and people can see where I've gone. But there wasn't a single person that I fictionalized that wasn't based on some aspect of the truth. The staggered timelines is a device of mine that I quite like. I actually did it with Susanna's book as well. With her book, because it encompassed her entire life from childhood in Pilsen all the way through to the end of her life in Prague, age 90, having become one of the world's leading Baroque musicians, but also lived through over 40 years of very strict communist rule there, anti-Semitic communist rule, being sent out around the world as a paid musician to earn huge amounts of money, while her father and while her husband and her mother were held hostage, and then coming back and having to give the authorities 80% of her income. So I knew that if I wrote it strictly chronologically, it would almost feel like two books. It would be the childhood to the Holocaust, and then communism and her career, and finally her final years. So I interwove them right from the start, because that way I felt that you would really feel that you were traveling with her, not strictly chronologically. But I started, for example, she survived a terrible train crash in which many people died in 1961, and when she eventually emerged from that, somebody noticed the numbers on her arm from Auschwitz, the tattoos, and didn't believe she was a survivor. And so I thought, if I introduce that to begin with, the reader immediately knows she's a Holocaust survivor, that she was in Auschwitz because that was the only place they were tattooed, and that she's still suffering from people not believing her or denigrating her in some way. And yet she's this incredible powerhouse musician who, is world famous. So I wanted them to fall in love with that aspect of her from the start, and then go back to her childhood, and then interweave the chapters until finally they come together as one. So it was a similar sort of thing with Freddie. I start with him arriving at Auschwitz with children, and the horror of that and the shock of all that. And then I go back to his childhood, and then I interwove all the way through. You have to have your wits about you, because at some point those timelines meet. and you have to make sure that you haven't given anything away in the previous staggered chapter. But I think as a device, it works. It seems to work for me. It definitely worked for the Susanna book, and that did very well. And I think it just makes it a more interesting read, honestly.
You said that Freddie wrote a children's book. Did you want to tell us more about that?
He didn't write a children's book, no. Sorry.
Oh, you said there was something you had mentioned that you said you would talk more about
Oh,
later.
the
I thought I heard.
box, sorry. So he was in Terezin for a long time in the ghetto, and constantly worrying about the children, caring for the children. And he heard that a shipment of orphans from Poland, from Bialystok in Poland, had been brought in on the train. By then, they had built the railway right into the heart of the ghetto. And there was it was a well-oiled machine. It was a very tried and tested system. They came in, they were taken off the train, they were put in quarantine for a while, they were checked over, and then they were released into the ghetto. But with these children, that didn't happen. And that perplexed Freddie, and it bothered him enormously because there were 1,800 of them. And he'd heard from the Czech guards who were friendly to some of the prisoners, including Freddie, that they were in a really terrible state. So he defied all orders and he jumped over a wall to go and see them, and he got caught. And for that crime, he got sent to Auschwitz, which was a terrible, dreadful place. All the things we've heard about it, beyond our imagination, truly hell on earth. But instead of giving in to it immediately, he immediately set about finding a way to help the children. They were in a very unusual situation. Instead of all just being marched straight to the gas chambers, as happened with so many hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, they were put into a special family camp. And there was one reason for this, because the Red Cross were threatening to come and visit the camp. So they decided that for a while they'd try this out. They would keep people in one place all together, men, women, and children. They wouldn't shave their heads, they wouldn't put them in striped uniforms, and they would keep them there so that if the Red Cross came, they could say, look, they're fine, they're all fine, they're here. So he was very lucky from that perspective. But of course, the Nazis still had their routines, and one of the routines that was absolutely unwavering was roll call, appel, they called it. Every single morning and every single night, all 4,000 of them had to be counted, lined up in serried ranks of people, and counted and counted and counted and counted by the German soldiers. And if they missed count, they started again. And sometimes this went on for hours and hours. And the weather there could be really horrible, snowy, icy, wet. When it was wet, the clay was just sticky. You'd lose your shoes in it. And the children wouldn't stand still. They didn't understand. A 4, 5, 6-year-old child doesn't understand that it has to stand still all that time and wait for somebody to count them. They were running between people's legs, they were crying, they were sitting down, they were running up to soldiers with grubby hands and tugging on their trousers. And Freddie saw how distressing and alarming this was to the senior officers. So once again, instead of keeping his head down, instead of trying not to bring attention to himself in any way, he went directly to these officers. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death. Adolf Eichmann came to the camp and Freddie confronted him directly. He was fearless, and he went to them and he said, listen, I have a solution. You don't like these children running around. I can see that. The children aren't happy. There's a block at the end of the camp that's empty, block 31. Let me have that. Let me take the children. I'll bring some helpers in with me. We will count them. Give me the food. I'll feed them there. We'll teach them German. We'll teach them German songs. We'll teach them German orders. They'll understand everything. And then every night they'll go back to the barracks. And incredibly, the SS said, good idea. And of course, once he got that privilege, he kept stretching and stretching and stretching and stretching. And before anybody knew it, he had an artist come in and paint Disney characters on the walls, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. He had teachers coming in and teaching them by rote, by storytelling. They had I think they had 6 books or something, which were random crazy books, like a Freud psychoanalysis and an atlas of India or something. It was whatever was found from those who'd been sent to the gas chambers in their belongings. And he persuaded them to give him some wood for the fire so that he could cook their soup. They lived largely on a diet of water in the camp. They had what's called ersatz coffee in the morning, which was oily, black, tasted like petrol, coffee with maybe a tiny piece of black bread. And at lunchtime they had soup, but it really depended on how many vegetables you got and whether or not it was just liquid or whether you got a small piece of potato or a turnip or something. And then coffee again in the evening. But Freddie not only persuaded them that he could have the fires to light the fires to make the soup in that block, but he was able to keep the fires lit in the winter, and it was the only block in the entire camp that had a fire. And he knew also that there were teenagers suffering in the barracks who weren't allowed. They were too old to come into the block under the rules that the Nazis decided in terms of ages. So he persuaded the Nazis to allow some of these teenagers, like Susanna, who by then had followed him to Auschwitz with her mother, to come in and be a teenage helper. And so he was able to give them some respite as well from these horrible overcrowded barracks where people were dying daily. It was an extraordinary thing he did. He even put on little shows, little musical plays, and he taught them songs. So as literally the railway ramp was only 50 or so meters away, the railway ramp would come, the people would be disgorged from the train. Those that weren't special for the family camp, the Czech family camp from various other countries, Hungary especially at that time, were sent straight to the gas chambers. They saw them marching to the gas chambers, and those people, one of the last things they would have heard would have been children singing in the barracks not far away from them. It was the most amazing man. You asked me at the beginning why he's important, and I think now you probably understand, because he was an exceptional human being and he deserves to be remembered.
Yeah, this is an incredible story. Uh, and this is dangerous to get into current events, but I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't at least ask you about it. I live in the United States of America, where tomorrow, so we're speaking on June 13th, 2025. I don't know what'll happen between now and the time that this interview gets aired, but there's a military parade, the first one, as far as I know, since the 1991 here in the United States. Also, our president recently federalized the National Guard in California and sent them into the streets. Um, so the reason I'm asking is because these things are analogous to what happened all those years ago, and we look at the past as like, oh, well, that we're past all that. We can't, that's not going to happen again. But these stories continue to come out more and more, and it seems like we can't get exhausted of them because we need them. We need these reminders. And before this interview, we were talking about you're coming here to the U.S. to make some speeches at the Holocaust Museum, and you do work with the Holocaust Museum in D.C. So, with all that said, can you talk a little bit about just how important it is that we continue to tell these stories and we continue to do this work, and what happens if
Yeah,
we don't?
of course. I mean, for me, has spent the last 10 years really in the Holocaust and in World War II, in my head, in my work, in my writing, in my traveling, in my speaking in schools, speaking to museums, cathedrals, government officers, everybody. For me to see what's happening in the world, generally speaking, even the Uyghurs in China and what's happening to them that we don't even know about, and what's happening in Russia to people like Navalny imprisoned in camps and so on. Never mind what's happening in the Middle East, never mind what's happening elsewhere. It's a dreadful reminder of everything that I've been working towards. And I can remember even when I was working with Susanna, I left her on the Friday after doing all my research with her over several visits in Prague in 2017. And she died on the Tuesday. And although she had been unwell, she was well when I was with her, and there was no indication that was going to happen. And one of the last things I asked her was how worried she was about the rise of nationalism in Europe. And she closed her eyes and clasped her hands together and said to me, Wendy, history is repeating itself with dreadful symmetry. And I can remember being shuddering at that phrase, the dreadful symmetry of it. And the truth is that dreadful symmetry continues and continues and continues. And especially as we're losing Holocaust survivors, there's very few of them left alive now, and some of them, many of them have gone. It's so important for us to remember these stories and to try to learn lessons from the history of the past and to see what happens when anti-Semitism and racism and hate speech and a lack of respect for difference is allowed to take hold without people standing up to it like Freddie Hirsch. And so I think these stories are timeless and timely at the moment. And if we don't listen to them, if we don't pay attention to history, if we don't continue to be kind, to be compassionate, to think of others, and put ourselves in other people's shoes, then we are really heading for a world that many of us won't want to live in.
I wonder, through all your research and through writing this story about Freddie, what have you learned about human nature, both the immense cruelty that can exist and also the immense compassion and courage?
Well, I've always looked, even when I was a war correspondent as a journalist, I've always looked for the humanity and the inhumanity, and it is always there to be found somewhere. There's that wonderful expression that hope is a candle in the darkness, and just one candle can light an entire room of darkness. And from that one candle, a million candles can be lit. And I love that analogy. And candles are often used in Holocaust analogy and in Holocaust literature for that very reason, I think. But it's not just the Holocaust. The people that were in the camps were literati. They were gay. They were Christians. They were dissidents. They were professors. They were Sinti. They were gypsies. They were whatever, anything that was against the Reich or enemies of the Reich, considered to be enemies of the Reich, were imprisoned and murdered in their thousands, in millions in many cases. So human nature has always, to my mind, so far risen against evil. The good in human nature has always risen against evil, and there are always enough good people, it seems to me, and historically there have been, to ultimately end the rule of tyrants and despots. Even though it can often take a very long time, as it did with World War II, and cost the lives of countless numbers of people. But I am an optimist. My father was an optimist. He raised me to be an optimist, and he raised me to believe that in our own lives, in our own small world, in our own bubble, whatever we can do to continue to be good, to be kind, to be compassionate, and to spread that out. Because when you smile at the stranger in the street and they smile back at you, there's been some sort of connection, there's been some sort of interaction. So if you can extend that to a kind gesture, to a compliment, to helping somebody across the road, to picking up some fallen shopping, to grabbing a child to stop them running in front of a car, those little gestures, those acts of kindness, those good deeds every day, which is what Freddie instilled in the children as part of the Scout movement, they have a ripple effect. And that's what the world needs. And we need to have this ripple effect. And reading books like this one and many, many others about people who were so incredibly brave in the worst circumstances and risked their own lives every single day just to be kind, just to be thoughtful, just to think of others before themselves. Those are the candles that we need to gather around and light our own candles from.
Well, thank you, Wendy. That's such an important message. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Congratulations on the Teacher of Auschwitz. Thank you for sharing Freddie's story, and thank you for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you very much. It's very important work to me. It means a great deal to me. And I feel that really my whole life has led to this, from my father's influence all the way through being a journalist and a war correspondent to now writing about this at this time in history. I feel it is a really, it's a wonderful opportunity. I feel privileged and honored to chronicle these stories and bring them to the world.
Well done, and thanks again.